Hello everyone and welcome to part 3 of our July paint along. Part 3 of the series is when we actually get to apply the pastel. So those of you who've been very patient and just waited to do the underpainting, now it's time to apply the pastel itself to the painting. So before we do that, I wanted to talk to you about a different approach that we're going to take. It's kind of similar to the way I approach a painting, but I thought it would be interesting to try something different. And if you recall from week 1, this book, what was it called? Expressing the Visual Landscape. And the chapter written by Timothy Thies. And what he talked about is the approach he uses is, he calls it the questioning approach to start a painting. And he does it for plein air. We're going to adapt it for the studio, but it's really great way to start a plein air painting because it allows you to capture the boundaries before the conditions change. So you ask yourself before you start the painting some questions. We already asked ourselves this question: what is my story? And if you recall, my story was misty. That's my story word. I want to capture the misty, moody quality of this landscape. So when I start the painting, I'm going to ask myself the following questions. Where is my darkest dark? And what I will actually do when I ask these questions and find the answer is note it. It's like I'm taking notes. My darkest darks are going to be in these foreground trees. So I'm just going to use a dark blue to indicate the darkest darks. The next question, where will my lightest lights be? And the lightest lights are going to be up in the sky. And so I know it's a moody day, so why don't we put a pale violet up there? So I just make a little note. I'm not going to paint the whole thing, I'm just noting these extremes. Where is the hardest edge going to be? And where's the softest edge going to be? Now, edges is a whole other topic that we are going to get into probably sometime this fall. It's a very important topic of painting, or concept rather, but the hardest edge is where you will be able to see the division of shapes, and typically that is around that center of interest where you want the eye to look. So I'm going to imagine that my center of interest is going to be right here in this general slightly off center area. So I'm just going to put a couple of hard edges for that bush so that we can see where the hard edges are. Soft edges are where we can't see borders, where colors just kind of morph into another color or slip into another color. In other words, you don't see the separation, and that's going to happen as we go into the distance. So I don't really need to note that. I just, in my mind, I note where it's going to get softer. And then the other question is, what are the easiest colors to see? So imagine if you're out plein air painting and you see this bright yellow-green light in the distance and you really love that color. Make a color note of it on your painting, and then you'll remember, oh yes, that's the color I want to get, and I know how to mix that color, or I have that color in my set. Then the final question is, will I allow my underpainting to show? And sometimes you don't have control over this because we just get carried away and we cover everything up, and that's fine. But if you have an underpainting that you really like and you want it to show, ask yourself, do I really want it to show? And if it's yes is the answer, then you have to use a very light touch for most of the painting so that these colors will peek through. If you recall from week 2 on the underpainting, I selected red violet because I wanted to get a moodier feeling rather than a bright sunny day. If I wanted a bright sunny day, I probably would have selected red or red orange. Alright, so now I've asked myself those important questions, and now it's time to move on to the actual painting. But do you see how, or can you imagine how asking yourself these few questions before you even pick up a pastel and start painting will give you the background information you need to do a more effective job? What I'm doing now is I'm using a dark blue, and I'm working with my set of floral landscape pastels. I talked about this last week and in the first week. But I'm reestablishing all of the dark shapes. Now, if you recall, we talked about how the trees in the distance can't be as dark as the trees in the foreground. So I'm not going to, actually I'll go one more level. I just know that as I add pastel to these areas, I'm going to have to make them lighter. So that's fine for now. That's one layer of dark. I usually like to do 2 or 3 layers of dark just to make it more interesting. So I'm going to reinforce that red violet. I'm going to use a red violet pastel, and very softly, a light touch is the right touch. I like to say that because I want to remind myself. How do I know it's a light enough touch? If I can still see the colors underneath, and if I can still see the underpainting, I've used a light enough touch. Here, I can't see it anymore, so I probably pressed a little bit too hard. Finally, I'm going to add some green, because after all, these trees are green. Excuse me. And the trees in the foreground are really a collection of trees or bushes. It's not just one bush. They're actually treetops. But I can make them into bushes if I choose, because remember, I have an artistic license and I'm not afraid to use it. So as I go back into space, into the distance, I know that I have to make those darks a little bit lighter. So I'm going to use a lighter and cooler, actually. I'm going to use a blue to indicate those tiny trees that we see in the distance. I'm just making a few smaller marks with my blue pastel. So it's cooler, it's slightly lighter, but it's definitely cooler and smaller. These things get smaller as we go into the distance. So there I have established all of my dark areas. So this would be a good time, if you're painting along, to stop, pause the video, and go ahead and establish your dark areas in your painting. And then when you come back to me, we're going to move on and paint the light areas. So I'm going to actually jump up into the sky and paint the sky. Now in my photo, my reference photo, you can actually see a little peak of blue that goes right across the photo. That's a very boring composition. In fact, it's not a very strong composition because it just makes a dividing line. This is where you have to say, you know what, maybe the sky looked like that, but that's not going to make a very good painting. It'll be more effective if I somehow can draw your eye down into the landscape. So I'm going to use a variety of light, cool, dull colors. So I don't want to use that bright blue. And just simply layer the colors together. This is what I call a fractured sky. And if you'll check your index that I shared with you last week, I talk about the sky and painting sky and clouds. It was last year. So if you need a refresher on painting skies and clouds, then have a look at the index to see where you can find that information. What I'm doing is I'm just picking colors that are similar in value, and I'm lightly layering them. Now I'm looking in my box because what I would like to have is a little bit of green up in the sky. And you're probably thinking, green up in the sky? Why would you want that? That's kind of strange, and I don't see it in the photo. And you know, honestly, I don't see it in the photo either. But the idea is I want to be sure that what is happening up in the sky has some sort of visual connection to what's happening on the ground. So if I put a green up in the sky, I know that I'm going to have a lot of green in the ground on the in the painting. So putting the green up in the sky will allow us to have this wonderful visual connection between what's happening in the sky and what's happening on the ground. And while it may seem odd, it actually is a really good device. So there's my sky. I used a pale yellow at the horizon, and I started to go over some of the distant bushes, and I'm actually going to smudge them with my finger because I want, remember, what's my word? Misty. So you're probably thinking, well, how are you going to make it misty? Well, one way to make it misty is to soften, this is a soft edge with my finger, those distant trees. Then I'm going to take, that might not be a pale blue, one of the blues that I used in the sky, and I'm going to very lightly, scumble, that's the word when you just very lightly paint over a shape. Now, I don't know if you can get close to this, but you can see where I have put in that dark shape, smushed it a little bit with my fingers, softened it, and then dragged a little bit of the light blue pastel over it, obscuring it, pushing it into the distance. So that is how you create the misty quality. Put in the shape and then lightly drag a lighter color on top so that you can still see the shape peeking through. So there we have the sky. I think I'm going to leave the sky alone for now. I may revisit it. One thing I want to point out is look at how I'm created the clouds or the marks going down to the ground rather than straight across. So if you're painting along, this is a good time to stop the video and go ahead and paint your sky. And now that you have finished the sky, we're going to go ahead and paint in the, I think I'm going to address the hedgerows. I guess these are just dividing the space of the land into sections. So we don't want to have stripes going across the page. And if you look at the photo, there's a stripe here, a stripe here, a stripe here, and actually if I were to measure them, they're all the same thickness. If I painted just the way I saw it, it would actually look like stripes. It would not be interesting. So I'm taking out my artistic license and changing the direction of my hedges so that I have more interesting division of space. So I know that these are cooler and duller in the distance. These are the darkest and the warmest. So I'll start by adding a little bit of light to these foreground bushes. And I'm going to work with the greens now. There's actually a green bush in the foreground that is much warmer, has a nice kind of yellow, golden yellow glow. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. Actually going to make it a little bit warmer. Alright, and then as I go back, they're going to get lighter and duller and cooler. Let's see, I think I just used that one. That one won't work. Let's try this one. And I'm just scumbling, I guess that's the word of the video, very lightly on top of that. I'm going to add a little bit of a blue gray to push it back. And I'm going to take that same blue gray and scumble over the dark blue that I put in first to push those back into the distance. So you have warmer, gets a little bit cooler, gets a little bit cooler, and even a little bit lighter. I could make it even lighter still as I go into the distance by using the very pale blue gray that I have in my set. That pushes it back even more. Add just a little bit back in here. Alright, so now I've started to create that feeling of depth. Now I'm going to go ahead and paint in the grassy sections. And what I want to do before I do that is reinforce this red-violet color by putting in some of the mauve colors that I have in my set. Now this is, the reason for doing this is to make what's underneath the green a little bit more interesting. Because remember, we have a lot of green and we need to have some kind of relief for all this green. I'm going to add a little bit of peach into this middle section. Still a dull color. Remember, I do want some of the underpainting to peek through, so I'm going to be careful not to cover it all up. What about this? It's a little bit too dark. I picked up a red, violet, or purple, thinking that might be good for the dirt, but it's a little too dark, so I'm going to put that back, and I think I'll just take this mauve color again. Now, one thing I want you to notice, I'm going to point it out to you in just a second, is that as I'm applying the pastel, I am changing the direction of my marks to help describe the lay of the land. So in the distance, I went side to side. In this middle ground, I went from top to bottom, pulling it down towards the bottom. On this foreground field, I went from side to side, pulling it towards the tree. So I have change in direction of my marks, which will help us feel the way these hillsides go. If I made all my marks straight across, it would look flat. So I'm using my marks to help describe the lay of the land. So this is a good time for you to pause the video, go ahead and finish your hedges, and go ahead and put in some more dirt color, or color that's going to look interesting underneath the greens. And use a light touch so that you can allow the underpainting to show through. And when you come back, you may take this step if you wish. I'm going to spray a little workable fixative on my foreground area. And by the way, I just finished this. I'm using Blair Very Low Odor fixative, workable fixative. It's not a final fixative, meaning I can work on top of it. We're going to be studying foregrounds the month of August, and I just finished working on a lot of my plans, so I'm really excited about that. And one of the techniques I use is to use the workable fixative. So we're going to paint the grass. I'm going to use the duller, cooler, more neutralized greens for the distance, and I'm going to paint in narrow horizontal bands. Now, do you remember when I started this painting, I said, but I really like this bright yellow green. Whatever it is, it's some kind of flower growing in the field. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in because, again, I remembered that I really liked it. And because I put it in the beginning, I didn't forget that I liked it, because that happens. Oh, that got up a little bit too high. Let's see if I can't cut into it with this other. There we go, that's a better transition. Narrow horizontal bands, and remember the direction of your marks should help describe what it is you're painting. And this little area here, I'm putting in another bit of hedges because I have to divide these two sections. Is it like that in my photo? It's not. But my photo, if I were to try to paint exactly what I saw in the photo, I would not have an interesting composition or arrangement of shapes. So just keep that in mind. We have to sometimes override what we see in the photo to make a more interesting arrangement of shapes or design to our painting. So now we need another color green to go in this middle hillside. So I'm picking another lighter, duller green. And remember what I wanted to do. I wanted to make my marks. I'm going to do like these linear marks going towards the foreground. And if you get up close, you can look and see I'm making linear marks, allowing the underpainting to peek through. So it looks like I actually made some crops growing there, and that was just simply by allowing the underpainting to peek through and making linear marks. Now we have, what did I do? I ended up creating another division of space, which is kind of cool. So now let's put in some color, and why don't we go the opposite direction. Again, thinking of the lay of the land so I can get that feeling of hillsides in my painting. So now I have this section, this section, this section, this section, and now all I have left is the foreground section. So I want that to be the warmest. This is a little bit dark, but it is a warm color. I'm going to just scumble it over very lightly, but that's not the color I want. I already used, I didn't use this color. This is still also a little dark, but I can still put it in. And I have to start to break up the tree shape. So the tree shapes are now not very interesting. So I'm using this background color, this grass color, to start carving the shape of the foreground trees. Let's see, I don't think I used this green yet. This is a nice bright Irish green. Good color for grasses. Now I don't want it to be super yellow, warm green, because I have to remind myself, misty. So it's okay that these greens are on the cooler side because I'm trying to go for that misty, overcast quality. So I'm not going to use the yellows and the yellow greens in this foreground area. Back here is okay because those were something green or yellow that were growing in the distance. If I wanted to tone it down just a little bit, I could take a dull yellow and then just slightly tone it down. It doesn't really bother me. I know a lot of times we talk about aerial perspective and how you can't have things get lighter, duller, cooler as you go into the distance, but there are exceptions to every rule, and this happens to be an exception, that's just a different color grass that grows in the distance. Maybe it's flowers. I can get away with it being back there because there's no detail. It's fuzzy, out of focus, so it can live back there and feel okay. So I've gotten to the point in the painting where I've got everything covered. But everything is sort of soft and out of focus, right? We don't have detail anywhere yet. So this is the point in time where I like to stop in a painting and step back and evaluate, what does this painting need? What is working? What isn't working? What is my story? Where do I want the viewer's eye to look? And then I write these things down, and then I go back and I make those adjustments. So one of the things that I like to do, and I'm going to just show you right now, because this is a great thing for you guys to do as well, is take the magic mat, put it up on your painting. I actually will tape it up there after the video. I'll leave it up this way for the week. Every time I come into the studio, I'm going to take a glance at this painting and I'm going to say, what does this painting need? Where can I make an adjustment? Where can I add clarity, harder edges, brighter color perhaps, just a little bit more focus and clarity? And where do I want it to slip away and go into space? So I'm going to leave this alone for the next week and evaluate it, and then we'll come back next week and make those adjustments based upon what I have seen through my observations. So I've gotten it far enough where I really need to step back and take a break and look at it. So I hope that you will enjoy this week's painting. Sorry. And I hope you enjoy having fun with this. This is a lot of fun, but remember, this is the trick for this week. Think of the lay of the land and make your pastel marks to help describe those hillsides and those trees. And I'll see you next week. Let's have fun and let's paint.